The following story was written as part of a fully online writing class designed and taught by author Megan J. Meehan. The stories from this class were subsequently printed in an anthology series titled Wicked Writing Volume 1, courtesy of Stitched Smile Publications. To join the next class, email Megan J. Meehan directly at artsywa.tiveit@gmail.com. To purchase a copy of the book, visit its Amazon page, linked in the description below. And to learn more about Stitched Smile Publications, visit their official website at www.stitchedsmilepublications.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Megan and her authors, and enjoy the story. Tom placed his time card into the punch clock. 3:14 p.m. was stamped onto it, just a minute before the afternoon huddle. Placing his punch card back into its rightful slot, he headed over to the break room. He never looked forward to the afternoon huddles. They usually always brought bad news, and today was no different.
From this day forward, H&G Machining will now be a smoke-free company. No longer shall anyone smoke in the vicinity of the property.
His boss, Mr. Mason, announced to the grumbling employees. He said this with a slight smile. Russ, a second shift employee, scoffed. Mr. Mason beamed at him, as if to shut him up, and Russ looked down without a word. Most of the employees were smokers, and this news brought no joy to them at all, especially Tom. In fact, Tom spoke up in a voice that had become raspy from years of heavy smoking. Why all of a sudden are we being punished for our God-given right to smoke? Everyone looked at Tom, and then back to Mr. Mason. The boss put a hand to the right side of his head and started to massage his temple.
Oh, you know why, Tom.
What? Because of Steve and Benny?
Yes, because of Steve and Benny.
Steve and Benny were two second-shift employees that were presumed dead. Benny went missing from his shift 3 months ago, and Steve disappeared more recently. They both went missing after going outside for a smoke break. The two of them, plus Russ, rounded out the night shift. With Tom's interruption, the break room broke into a rumor mill. The grumbling employees went on about how Steve and Benny weren't just missing, but dead. Others said they just left town to get away from their wives, which was a very strong possibility. I heard a bear mauled Benny to death on a hunting trip, and Steve got mowed down by a bus, one coworker said to another.
Nah, man, I heard they both died on the job, right in the back alley,
the other coworker whispered back. Tom overheard their conversation and grimaced. He couldn't speak for the bus, but he knew a bear wouldn't stray this far away from wilderness. Being a hunter, he knew a thing or two about bears. Even though juicy rumors swam around the break room, all Tom could think about was the dreaded second shift with its newly implemented no-smoking rule. 2 days after Steve's disappearance, Tom was informed that he would have to replace Steve on the saw. After all, someone had to keep the saw running during the second shift, or else they would never hit the projected numbers that the company demanded. Tom wasn't too fond of working second shift. He usually went out on a drinking binge around 8 p.m. with his buddies. He used the time to complain about the 2 strikes he earned at work, and lament that if he received one more, it would mean automatic suspension, or even worse, getting fired. Tom enjoyed those drinking sessions. It was a good opportunity to shoot the shit, complain about ex-wives, the boss, and what the libtards were doing to the damn country. Working second shift was akin to a punishment. Tom couldn't drink or shoot the shit, and now he couldn't even smoke. This was crossing the line. Prisoners had more freedom. Steve and Benny were chain smokers, Tom sneered at his boss. We shouldn't get punished for their... Tom was drawing a blank. The word was at the tip of his tongue. Dumbassery! He finally shouted aloud. That was not the word he wanted to use, but it got his point across suitably. Stern looks flashed towards Tom from his fellow co-workers, but he didn't care. In fact, he actually enjoyed the attention.
Oh, and you're so much better?
Mr. Mason retorted, and leered over at Tom, seemingly attempting to send a message with his eyes. But Tom was oblivious. Well, yeah, he replied heatedly, damn well knowing that there were 4 or 5 cigarette butts laying on the ground outside the driver's side door of his car. He had smoked all those cigarettes in the spare 10 minutes he had before punching in for the meeting. His truck was the jacked-up 4x4 that was probably compensating for something, parked in one of the 2 only handy-capable spots at the company. It reeked from a few years of accumulated cigarette smoke. He always got to work on time, so he could have some time to smoke before having to deal with whatever work had in store for him. He typically smoked about 2 packs a day, which was an improvement from his previous record. So Tom had a smoking habit, if that's what you wanted to call it. He smoked anytime he could. When he was anywhere besides work, Tom always kept a cigarette butt hanging out of his mouth. His pearly whites had yellowed from years of smoking, and 2 of his front teeth were missing. The veins on his arms had become so prominent that he could almost see the blood pumping throughout his body. He had a bad cough that could scare anyone in his vicinity. When the company asked for checkups, he went to his doctor's office, where he was informed that if he continued his bad habit, it was only a matter of time before he collapsed from a heart attack, or worse, lung cancer. But Tom didn't care. It was his body, and he'd do whatever the hell he wanted with it. 3 hours passed, and Tom itched for a cigarette. He looked up at the clock and saw it was 6:30 p.m. It was time for his first break. Just 1 cigarette, Tom. Just 1. It won't hurt you, Tom. Just smoke 1. He went outside and pulled out his lighter. He put the cigarette into his mouth and was about to light it when he saw a security camera turn his way. The camera looked as if it were focusing on him, zooming out, then back in again. Becoming paranoid, Tom put the cigarette back into its pack and stuck it in his back pocket. As he turned his back to the camera, he noticed another camera zooming in on him. Tom cursed, punched the door to the break room, then went inside. He needed to take his aggression out on somebody. Russ sat on one end of the break room, spinning his wedding ring on the tabletop. Chris sat beside Russ at the table, reading a book that Tom didn't recognize, although Tom wouldn't recognize any book he came across. "Chris, what the hell are you doing?" Tom yelled out. Tom didn't have an indoor voice, so Chris jumped a little, then shook his head in annoyance.
Oh, it's just a Ray Bradbury story about...
Does that book got any pictures in it? Tom interrupted.
No. Just the one on the cover.
Then how do you know what's going on?
Excuse me?
Come on, Chrissy. You ain't fooling no one here. Chris looked puzzled for a second, then realized the charade Tom was carrying on.
Look, I don't appreciate...
We know a dumbass like you couldn't get through a book unless it got pictures? Tom roared out in laughter. His laugh gradually turned into a wheeze, then a tear started to form in his right eye. You know, 'cause you can't read and all. Chris refused to take the bait. He was enjoying reading Fahrenheit 451 for the GED class he was taking. He was the shop bitch, or at least that was what his coworkers called him. Tom chief among them. When someone clogged up the toilet, Chris had to clean it up. When the local cat started going to the bathroom in the parking lot, he had to pick it up. He crawled inside the machines and cleaned them from within. He wanted to be a full-time machine operator. The company said they would pay for his school tuition if he aced all of his tests, and he knew he could do it. He just had to get one thing out of the way, his GED. He needed to work nights so he could go to class in the mornings. When an opening became available on the second shift, he jumped at the chance. The major downside being that he was exposed to Tom night after night.
Just leave me alone, Tom. I'm trying to read.
This, for some odd reason, pissed Tom off. He grabbed the book from Chris's grasp and started to flip through the pages.
Hey, I'm gonna lose my place.
Tom ignored him. Yep, I don't see a single picture in this book, Tom said, before hacking up as much phlegm as he possibly could and spitting it in between the book's pages. Then he walked to the trash can and dropped the book in. He laughed a hearty, yet wheezy, laugh. Russ looked over at Chris and shook his head. A few more hours passed. Tom was approaching his next break. The withdrawals were getting worse. Normally, he would have already smoked a pack by now. A voice in his head kept repeating the same thing over and over. Just one cigarette, Tom. Just one. It won't hurt you, Tom. Just smoke one. The need for nicotine was really getting to him. When his lunch break came, he hurried to his truck in a now nearly empty parking lot. Other than his truck, there was only Chris's van and Russ's motorcycle. Yet, when he made it, cameras were pointing at him from multiple angles. He cursed. Instead of lighting up a cigarette, he tried to get a nap in, but all he could think about was smoking. He thought about the good old days, the days before rules for smoking indoors were created. Back then, he'd burned through more packs than two people could put together. Smoking was a part of who Tom was. Smoking's in my genes, he'd say. His father and his father before him all smoked like chimneys. He received his first pack of smokes from his dad on his 12th birthday. He had been smoking cigarettes well before then, but that moment was like the passing of the torch, and it was Tom's time to puff. Tom leapt out of his gas guzzler and landed in a gray puddle. Disgusted, he lifted his boots, cringing as the gray muck slid off his heel. He didn't know what he landed in, but the scent it delivered was nauseating. His gaze glanced upward at the truck's door, where he saw a smudged handprint smeared across it. He touched the substance and brought it up to his nose. Appalled, Tom wiped his hand onto his pants. This must have been Chris's doing. It was an odd way to get back at Tom, but it was the only logical answer at the time. I'll get him back tomorrow, he thought. How he would, Tom didn't know, for all he could think about now was his need for a cigarette. Lunch ended, and he headed back inside. A couple more hours passed, unbearably. He thought about going to the restroom for a smoke, but the last time he did that, a coworker ratted him out, resulting in him earning his second strike. And it was people that didn't smoke, like Chris, who rat. Tom didn't want to risk it, though the need for tobacco was strong enough for him to chance it. He could go to the restroom, turn off the fire alarm, and puff up a storm until all his problems went away. The headache that was making home inside his head would be evicted as soon as he had a few puffs of that sweet, sweet cigarette. His last break finally came, and Tom was at his breaking point. He entered the break room and sat down at Russ's table. Russ was a tall, scrawny biker, but you could never tell by his demeanor that he rode with a biker gang. He was a pretty nice guy. He'd never snitched on anyone, including Tom. He mostly kept to himself, a characteristic that made Tom trust him. "I don't know how you did it," Tom said, hands twitching slightly.
Did what?
Russ asked, unwrapping paper that revealed the concealed gum inside. Russ knew where this conversation was heading.
You're talking about how I quit smoking, aren't you?
Yeah, how'd you do it, Russ? I can't even last an hour. I need a cig like a whore needs a big old...
It was hard.
Russ cut him off before Tom could get any further with his attempt at a joke.
There were moments where I thought about smoking and how one cig couldn't hurt.
He closed his eyes, as if to remember the sensation of smoking, and let out a big sigh.
Smoking is like a ball and chain. It won't let you go. Just make yourself work harder to live.
This was all nonsense to Tom. He simply wanted to know how to make it through the rest of the night without losing his mind. The rest of what Russ was saying was little more than unnecessary gibberish. Right. Well, anyway, do you know a spot around here one might be able to, Tom paused to look over at Chris, the rat, who was deep into reading his book. Tom leaned in closer to Russ, just to be safe. Russ could smell Tom's gnarly breath as he attempted to whisper, even though his whisper was about the same volume as someone's normal voice. Where a guy could get in a quick smoke break. Russ gave out a low chuckle.
Sorry. Can't help you there.
Tom frowned and pushed his seat out with his back as he got up and began to walk away. Russ looked over at Chris, remembering what Tom had done to his book. He recalled Chris spending his lunch break cleaning the slime out from between the pages. It was a little hard to watch. Russ managed to smile, and a change of mind turned in his head.
You know what, Tom? As an ex-smoker, I know what you're going through. I'll tell you a little secret.
Tom was instantly reeled back in.
Back when Steve and Benny were still around, we used to smoke in the alleyway out behind the shop.
Russ looked over at Chris to make sure he wasn't paying any attention as Tom sat back down beside Russ and leaned in closely. Russ's voice lowered a bit, just to make sure Chris wasn't listening.
Back when we'd take our smoke breaks in the back alley, I noticed that there's no security cameras in or around the area. You could probably pop a death stick and smoke one without Mr. Mason catching you on tape. Just grab a trash bin so the cameras inside the shop don't catch you going outside for no reason. Man, Steve, Benny, and I would smoke so much the fire department would get called to the scene. Oh man, those were the days.
Russ laughed, then continued.
God, I miss Steve and Benny. You know, they're the reason why I gave up smoking in the first place. I quit because...
Russ looked over at Tom and noticed that he wasn't interested in this bit. His leg was bouncing like crazy, like an addict without his drugs.
Looks like you need to smoke badly, huh?
Russ popped the gum into his mouth and began to chew. Tom looked at him yearningly. I'll die if I don't get a cigarette in me. He got up from his seat and thanked Russ profusely, even hailing him a lifesaver. Tom was looking forward to trying out the new spot. Other than his truck, the only other place he smoked was in the restroom, which ended after the rat snitched on him and he received his second strike. Something that kept going through his mind repeatedly, just like that one phrase. Just one cigarette, Tom. Just one. It won't hurt you, Tom. Just smoke one. He had an hour left on his shift till it was punch-out time. His lungs were begging him for a cigarette. Just one cigarette, Tom. Just one. It won't hurt you, Tom. Just smoke one. His head pounded, and the room began to spin. He felt as if he were on a tilt-a-whirl ride at the carnival. He felt as if he was going mad. He tried to concentrate on his work, but he found himself looking at the clock every 10 seconds, thinking at least 10 minutes had gone by. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to smoke. Tom remembered what Russ told him and grabbed a trash bin. It wasn't really filled with anything. 2 empty chip bags and a torn rubber glove. It didn't matter, though. Bolting his way toward the door, he excitedly sprinted into the dark outside. It was a little chilly, but not winter weather. A fall jacket would be seasonable, but Tom was tough. Or, at least, that's how he rationalized his unwillingness to wear something with sleeves. If he wore sleeves, then no one would be able to see his ink, which he always kept covered up during his day shift. On his arm was a tattoo from Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. The original cover art, as Tom liked to point out. It depicted the aftermath of a graphic assault perpetrated by a robot, and an otherworldly, ferocious metal beast with knives for teeth about to devour the mechanical assailant. When he was younger, he was in love with that album, and the art it held immersed him. Lots of people scorned him for his racy ink, but he didn't care. He began walking to the dumpster at the far end of the shop, right next to the holy spot, the back alleyway that Russ told him about. Just one cigarette, Tom. Just one. He was going to give in. Tom lifted the lid of the dumpster and chucked the bag inside. He slammed it down and walked over to the dark alleyway. He looked around to see if Russ's story held true. He scanned the wall, one end to the other, and decided that there were no cameras in sight. He looked past the corner of the wall to see if there was anyone outside. He didn't see Russ or that supposed rat, Chris. Tom smiled. He almost jumped up and clicked his heels. He whipped out his pack of smokes and stuck the butt of the cigarette into his mouth. The lighter came out next. He put his thumb on the wheel and struck down. A flame erupted from it. He pulled the lighter to his mouth and burned the tip of the cigarette. He inhaled deeply as smoke filled up his lungs. He held it in for a few seconds and then released. A white cloud filled the air, and Tom let out a big sigh of relief. The cigarette smoke pacified him instantly. He put the cigarette back into his mouth and took another long drag. Again, he held it in his lungs for a few seconds before releasing. Other than the light being emitted by his cigarette, the only other illumination in the dark alley was high up, near the roof of the building. Tom took a few more drags of the cigarette. It was bliss. He didn't care if he spent the rest of his shift outside. He had almost hit his numbers anyway, which was better than what he usually did. Sure, he could go back inside and work for another hour, but then they would start to expect it from him. And he would hear it from his boss for sure. Mr. Mason would laugh at him and tell him, "See, this is what you could accomplish if you weren't taking a 5-minute smoke break every 20 minutes or so." To have to work harder without the help from his cigarettes? Tom didn't want to think about that. All he wanted to think about was, well, nothing at all. He just wanted to inhale his cigarette and let his shift pass on by. Suddenly, the light in the alleyway began to flicker. Tom looked over his shoulder and noticed the silhouette of a man just beyond the circumference of the light. Tom quickly threw the cigarette to the ground and stomped on it, grinding it into the pavement with his steel-toe boot. He turned toward the man and went to say something, but there was nobody there. Tom became a little uneasy. He knew damn well there was just a man standing past the light. Hastily, he started walking toward where he saw the figure standing and turned just to make sure nothing was following from behind. He turned his head back toward the other end, where he originally saw the silhouette, and saw a man walking toward him. "Russ, is that you?" Tom called, with a slight quiver in his voice. "Hey, you finally decided that Nicorette gum just wasn't doing it for you?" The man walked a few more paces, then dropped to the ground. "Hey, you all right?" Tom cried out. The man on the ground didn't move. In fact, Tom could barely make out the body from where he stood. He crept toward the man, but stopped a few inches short. Something was off. Tom could just feel it. He got the same feeling once when he was out hunting deer with his buddies. A bear came from his rear and startled them. He'd never admit it, but he damn near wet his pants. They remained as still as they could, and eventually, after looting their food and destroying the tents, the bear left them alone. But this figure, didn't seem to have any intention of leaving him alone. Tom reached for his lighter and flicked a flame out of it. Waving the lighter toward where the man apparently fell, he discovered that it wasn't a man at all. It was just a puddle of muck. But the smell was oddly familiar to him. Tom knelt down and dipped his fingers into the puddle that smeared the ground. He rubbed the thick liquid between his finger and thumb. Its texture was slimy, yet rough at the same time. Tom brought it up to his nose to smell it. He couldn't pinpoint what the aroma was, but he knew it was familiar. He turned his phone over to check the time. It read 11:42 p.m. It was getting close to closing time. My mind is playing tricks on me, he thought, and started to make his way out of the alley. He got to the light, and it suddenly went out. Caught off guard, Tom jumped and cursed from the surprise. He put his back to the wall and took in several deep breaths. "It's the lack of cigarettes that has me on edge, that's it. That's all it was," he thought. He realized he needed to calm down before going inside, so he reconciled with himself and decided another smoke was necessary to carry on with the rest of his night. Putting another cigarette into his mouth, he began to pull the lighter toward his lips. He lit the cigarette, closed his eyes, and took a long drag, holding it deep in his lungs and finally exhaling out a big cloud of smoke. That's when Tom heard it. A deep, guttural growl at the end of the alleyway toward where the muck lay. He turned his head to see a man languidly walking toward him. "Hey, Tom muttered, but stopped mid-sentence. The outline of the thing seemed way bulkier than before. As it crept closer, it became larger in height until it was standing nearly 7 feet off the ground. Tom took a few steps backward, remembering the bear and the fear it had struck in him. He remained perfectly still, as if he were dealing with a T-Rex. He considered running, but the thought trailed off as the light in the alleyway began to flicker back on. And now Tom could just make out what this thing was. And it was just that. A thing. Standing underneath the light was an inhuman figure. Its bones protruded outwards, revealing a rib cage that extended much larger and longer than a human one would. Its entire body was covered in sludge. Its arms and legs were clumped with something, as if the thing was covered in black tumors. Its face was the worst part of its skewered anatomy. It had long, darkened, yellowed teeth that came to jagged points. What little hair it possessed was thin and greasy, and the thing had no eyes. Its hands morphed into 4 long fingers, each ending in a knife-like claw that extended too long. The thing was wheezing. It was a deep and ungodly sound. The creature stood over Tom. His cigarette dropped to the side of his mouth and fell to the ground. The creature was taking deep breaths, as if it were taking in his scent. Tom took a few more steps backwards, then turned to run, but it was no use. The creature went for one of Tom's legs, grabbed his ankle, and swept him off his feet. The monster was extremely agile. Tom kicked at the thing's arm, but its grip didn't loosen. It let go, and before Tom could attempt to crawl to safety, it burrowed its nails into the middle of Tom's chest like an Olympic dive. Its claws broke through Tom's breastbone. Tom let out a wail and grabbed at the thing's arms, but again, it was no use. It had its nails underneath Tom's ribs now. It let out a huge roar, and its arms moved apart from one to another, as if it were performing a breaststroke. Blood spattered on the ground and the wall, and Tom's face was one of agonizing pain. He whimpered, for that was all Tom had left in him to do. His chest was exposed. His beating heart thumped near lungs that were blackened from years of indulging in a bad habit. The creature grabbed at both of Tom's lungs and ripped them from their place in his chest cavity. Tom lost the ability to breathe. Before life left him, he looked up at the monster one final time. The beast took one lung and hovered it over its mouth, then squeezed like a sponge. Blood and a tar-like substance poured into the monster's mouth like an expunged orange. As it gulped it down and swallowed, the creature tossed the lung to the side, then it moved to the other one. Tom's eyes fluttered, then closed shut, and everything went dark. Chris swiped his time card through the punch clock and hollered at Russ to have a good night. Russ nodded to him and stuck his card into the machine. He walked outside to the parking lot, saw Tom's truck, sighed, and made his way toward the alleyway. Russ fully expected to find Tom in the alleyway. Instead, he found what was left of him. Lying on the ground was Tom's ransacked corpse. Russ immediately pulled out his phone and dialed his boss's number.
We got another death due to smoking.
Let me guess. Was it Tom?
Yep. The sorry bastard went outside for a smoke break. Guess he couldn't help himself.
Oh, God damn it, Tom. That insubordinate, stubborn piece of shit!
Russ went over to Tom's body and nudged it with his foot.
Did it leave everything except the lungs?
Yep. It left the rest of him in the alleyway, just like Steve and Benny.
Russ unwrapped a stick of gum and popped it into his mouth. Nicorette gum tasted god-awful, but the way he saw it, it was a lot better than getting your lungs ripped out of your chest.
Well, Russ, you know the drill.
Mr. Mason said calmly into the receiver.
Call in the cleaning crew and make sure that they clear all signs of the incident off the property. I'll inform the owners about the mishap in the morning.
Aye, aye, Captain,
Russ said in a monotone voice. He hung up the phone and proceeded to dial in the next number. Before he hit the call button, he looked down at Tom's body. Russ felt no remorse for what he had done. He knew what he was doing when he told Tom about the spot. He knew he was sending him to his doom, like showing a rat a piece of cheese, then leading the little critter to a fox's den and tossing the cheese in. But did he feel bad for Tom? Not really. Tom was an ass to just about everyone in the company. That little gag he pulled in the lunchroom with Chris pretty much sealed his fate. Yet, Russ was having a difficult time dealing with the loss of his fellow co-workers, Steve and Benny, and quitting cigarettes was slowly eating him away inside. He missed that damn feeling smoking brought to him. Even now, seeing the pack of cigarettes lying next to Tom's corpse had him itching. Just one cigarette, Russ. Just one. It won't hurt you, Russ. Just smoke one. Russ looked away in disgust at the realization that he could even consider risking his life for one drag from a death stick. That's what he called them now. Death sticks. 3 murders now, all due to them. Russ knelt down and picked up the pack of cigarettes. Tom was still clutching the lighter in his cold hand. Unfolding Tom's fingers, Russ took the lighter from Tom's dead grasp. Just one cigarette, Russ. Just one. It won't hurt you. Just smoke one. Russ grabbed his head. Just one cigarette, Russ. Just one. It won't hurt you. Just smoke one. The message kept repeating, over and over. Russ took a deep breath.
What the hell? One cigarette can't hurt. Right?
A huge, huge thank you to all of my poltergeists. Bobby Tripp, Calderon, Cheryl Meredith, Gary, Imugi, Joker Smurf 3, and Spirit Father. I'd also like to thank one of my apparitions this week, Rose Fish. As always, your support is so appreciated, and thank you from the very bottom of my heart.